The station had a sound before. Mara remembered it, the low hum of vents, the soft knock of boots on metal corridors. Someone always laughing somewhere down a hall. The station had been loud in the way that living things are loud, constantly and without apology. Now it was quiet. Not peaceful. Not restful. The kind of quiet that moves in after something large has left and has no intention of coming back. Mara Osei sat at the long glass table in what used to be the operations briefing room and looked at the number on the screen in front of her. She had been looking at it for a while. She was not sure how long. The coffee next to her had gone cold without her noticing. 11 billion. 240 million. 608,000. 312. The Varric had been precise. She would give them that. They called it a preemptive population correction. That was the phrase their representative had used when the first transmissions came through, before anyone fully understood what was happening, before the orbital defense networks went dark one by one, like lights being switched off in a house at night. Preemptive population correction. 6 words arranged in the most civilized order imaginable. She had read the full Varric statement 17 times in the first week. She kept waiting for the part where it stopped making her want to put her fist through the screen. It never stopped. The Varric were not a cruel species. That was the terrible thing. They were not sadistic. They did not hate humanity. They had run their models, looked at humanity's population growth rate, expansion velocity, and resource consumption trajectory, and concluded that the species represented a long-term threat vector to galactic stability. Then, they had done what their models told them was optimal. 72 hours. Clean. Surgical. Precise in the way that only something truly monstrous manages to be. The door behind her opened, and she did not turn around. She knew the footsteps. Deputy Director Han, from the Diplomatic Corps, walked the way all career diplomats walked carefully, like the floor was always slightly uncertain. He set a folder on the table next to her cold coffee. "The Concord delegation lands in 4 hours," he said. "They've asked for a preliminary meeting before the formal session. Ambassador Kelthorin will be leading their team." Mara did not look at the folder. "What do they want?" "To express condolences. To outline the framework for a response process." He paused. "They're bringing a legal team." She looked at him then. He had the expression of a man delivering news he had already made peace with, so that she would not have to watch him make peace with it in front of her. She appreciated that about Han. She always had. "A legal team," she said. "There will be questions about jurisdiction, about the tribunal process. They're estimating." He stopped. "How long?" 40 years. For a full proceeding. Possibly 35, with an expedited track. She nodded slowly. She turned back to the screen. The number sat there. The way large things sit, not demanding attention. Just occupying space. Impossible to look away from for long. The Concord delegation arrived at exactly the time Han had said they would. They were 4 species represented, 12 individuals, and they moved through the station's corridors with the careful respect of people visiting a hospital. Mara watched them from the observation deck. Their translator units glowed soft blue at their collarbones. The meeting was in the glass room. Ambassador Kelthorin was old by any measure. His species long-lived in a way that usually made other species either reverent or uncomfortable. He spoke warmly. He spoke at length. Words like grief and healing and shared galactic community moved through the air like furniture being arranged in a room. He used the word proportionality twice. He used the word dialogue 4 times. He talked about the importance of established process, about the Concord's commitment to accountability through lawful channels, about the patience required for justice to function with integrity. Mara listened. She took notes. Her handwriting was small and regular. The third member of the delegation, a younger official whose name she had already forgotten, leaned forward at one point and said, with genuine gentleness, that the Concord understood the human community was experiencing an understandable emotional response, and that this was natural given the circumstances of this bilateral incident. Mara's pen stopped moving. The room noticed. She looked at the official. He looked back. He had kind eyes. She believed he meant well. She believed almost everyone in this room meant well. in the particular way that people who have never had to mean anything hard mean well. She uncapped her pen and wrote something in the margin of her notes. She did not show it to anyone. She capped the pen again. "Thank you," she said. "We'll review the proposed frameworks." The delegation left satisfied. Han walked them to their shuttle. Mara stayed in the glass room and looked out at the dark where Earth used to be visible on a clear pass. The station's orbit had not changed. The view had. The UN Emergency Council convened 6 hours later. She attended via feed, her camera off. She listened to the votes. Diplomatic channels. Economic sanctions. A formal censure submitted to the Concorde's High Chamber. The tribunal process, 40 years, possibly 35. Measured responses. Appropriate responses. Responses that looked like something, and meant something, and would, in time, perhaps produce something. The military bloc did not vote. She checked the feed timestamp. They had left the chamber 11 minutes before the vote began. No announcement. No walkout. They simply were no longer there. She pulled up a secondary screen. Fleet positioning. She found what she was looking for in under a minute. The military bloc was not gone. They were in the lower station, the hangar levels, the parts of the station that still smelled like engine fuel and had lights that buzzed slightly in the cold. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her cold coffee, finished it in 2 swallows, and stood up. She opened her notes to the margin where she had written something during the meeting. She looked at it once. 2 words, written in her small, regular handwriting. She tore the page out carefully, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She went downstairs. The hangar was loud in the way that living things are loud, the clang of equipment, voices overlapping. Someone already at a tactical screen, pointing at fleet projections with the focused calm of a person who has stopped waiting for permission. No one looked up when she walked in. She did not need them to. She found an open terminal in the corner, set down her notepad, and opened a new file. At the top, she typed a heading. 2 words. She stared at them. They were not dramatic. They were not a declaration. They were just a direction. She began to write. Outside, through the hangar's small, reinforced viewport, the dark, where Earth used to be, sat at the edge of sight, not asking for anything, not waiting for anything. Just there. The way losses are there, not loudly, not demandingly, just occupying the space where something else used to be. Permanent in the simple, devastating way of permanent things. Mara typed, and did not look at it. There was work to do. The galaxy was watching. This was not a metaphor. Every species with long-range sensors had them pointed at human space. The Concorde's observation network logged 17 new monitoring requests in the first month after the genocide. Species that had never paid much attention to humanity were suddenly very interested. Not out of sympathy. Out of the particular attention that something unusual demands, the way everyone at a party turns to look when a glass breaks. They expected mourning, some ritual period of grief, then an appeal to the Concorde, then the long, slow process of institutional justice. That was the pattern. Every species that had faced catastrophe eventually found its way to the table. That was what civilization was. That was the whole point of it. Humanity was not going to the table. On the station, Mara had 3 screens running at all times now. Fleet logistics on the left, resource projections in the center. On the right, a live feed from the Concorde's diplomatic channel, message after message, carefully worded, increasingly urgent, going into a folder she checked once a day and responded to with the same 2-line acknowledgement. "We have received your communication. We will respond in due course." She had written it once. She copied it every time. The ships being built were not bigger than Varric ships. That was the thing that confused the Concorde's analysts at first, when their intelligence feeds started picking up the construction. Humanity was not trying to match the Varric in scale. Scale was not the game. She had explained this, once, to a junior officer who had asked why they weren't building heavier destroyers. "If you can't outweigh someone," Mara had said, "make yourself impossible to step on." The junior officer had nodded like he understood. He was 23. He probably did understand, in the way you understand something before you have seen what it costs. The Ardennes Protocol was Mara's design, built with people who had studied the oldest human wars, Not the space-age ones. The ancient ones. The ones fought in mud and cold with weapons that had to be carried on human backs. There was something in those old wars, some principle buried under the history, that the newer strategic models had smoothed over. She had dug it back out. You don't fight to destroy the enemy. You fight to make the enemy understand that destroying you will cost more than not destroying you. You make yourself expensive. You make yourself the kind of problem that it is easier to stop making than to finish solving. The protocol didn't have a clean shape. That was deliberate. Clean shapes could be modeled, could be countered. The Ardennes Protocol looked, from the outside, like disorganization, like human ships doing irrational things. It would take the Varric time to understand that the irrationality had a structure to it. By the time they understood, the point would already have been made. 3 weeks into the build, Mara received a message that was not from the Concorde. It was from Dr. Yusuf Ibarra. She knew the name. Everyone in the scientific community knew the name. He had spent 30 years writing about Varric culture, advocating for cultural exchange programs, publishing papers with titles like Toward a Shared Xenolinguistic Framework and The Case for Biological Empathy Across Species Lines. He had been the most prominent human voice for Varric-human cooperation in the academic world. The message was 4 sentences. I have been reviewing Varric structural biology for the past 6 weeks. I believe I have something useful. I am not asking for permission. Tell me where to send the files. She replied within the hour. She did not ask what had changed his mind. She had a reasonable guess. Some things don't need to be said. Yusuf worked in a research annex on a colony station 3 systems out from what used to be Earth. He had a small team, 6 people who had followed him there without being asked, who showed up one morning and began working without explaining themselves. He did not ask them to explain themselves. They understood each other without the conversation. He was a quiet man, ordinarily. The kind of quiet that was actually concentration rather than emptiness. He had always found the Varric fascinating, their biology, their chemistry, the particular way their neural architecture processed threat response. He had written beautiful things about it. He kept those papers in a folder he no longer opened. One afternoon, a younger researcher on his team, a woman named Sarah, who had been one of his graduate students, looked up from her screen and said, "Yusuf, are we sure about this?" He did not look up from his own screen. 11 billion, he said. He returned to his work. She did too. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Meanwhile, on a refugee colony 3 systems in a different direction, Priya Nair was teaching a class. The class was not in any official curriculum. The colony's administrative system listed her as a general logistics coordinator, which was accurate in the same way that saying a fire is warm is accurate, technically true, usefully incomplete. She was 41 years old, former schoolteacher, formerly from Mumbai, currently from nowhere in particular, and everywhere she needed to be. The class had 12 people in it today. Tomorrow it would be 9, or 15, or a different 12. They sat in a storage room that smelled like recycled air and old metal, and she talked to them in the low, even voice she had once used to explain fractions to 10-year-olds. The Concorde called what she was building a terrorist network. She had heard this. She did not have strong feelings about it either way. The Concorde had also called the Varric's genocide a bilateral incident. She had filed both assessments in the same place in her mind, which was the place where she put things that were technically words, but not actually information. She hummed while she worked. This was the detail that unsettled people who knew her. The low, tuneless hum, while her hands moved over equipment, while she drew logistics maps, while she organized supply chains that had no official existence. She was not performing calm. She was just calm. The grief had come, and she had felt it fully, and it had not killed her. And now, she was on the other side of it, in the clear, flat place, where the only question that remained was what to do next. She had a very clear answer to that question. The Concorde sent a second delegation to the orbital station. This one was larger, more species represented, higher-ranking officials, a sense of increased urgency that expressed itself through the number of people in expensive clothes standing in corridors. They wanted a meeting with Mara. She gave them 30 minutes. They talked about proportionality again, about the importance of measured response, about the galactic community's shared investment in stability. One of them, the one whose title translated roughly as Chief Mediator for Interspecies Crisis Management, said, with deep and visible concern, that humanity appeared to be acting on emotion rather than reason. A junior diplomat named Chen Wei responded on Mara's behalf. She had chosen him for this specifically. He was 29 years old, with a calm voice and a stillness about him that made people underestimate how precisely he was paying attention. He listened to the chief mediator. He nodded. He said, "We are being precise." The delegation asked for clarification. Chen Wei did not provide any. The meeting ended. The delegation filed out. Mara watched them go from the doorway, her arms folded, saying nothing. She went back to her screens. The fleet was taking shape. The protocol was embedded. Yusuf's files were coming in weekly now, dense and technical, and exactly what she needed. Priya's network was spreading through the refugee colonies like water, finding its level quietly, without announcement, along the paths of least resistance and greatest need. The galaxy was still watching. Good. Let them watch. Let them write their reports and hold their meetings and file their motions. Let them watch the feeds and run their own models and try to figure out the pattern in the thing they were looking at. By the time they understood the pattern, that too would already be beside the point. Mara turned off the diplomatic feed. Not permanently. Just for the night. She kept the fleet screen on. HFY had commanded fleets for 30 years. He was not arrogant about this. Arrogance was a biological failure, a corruption of the confidence function, a miscalibration. He was simply accurate. He had the data. 30 years of engagements, scenarios, conflict simulations, run across 17 variable sets. He had never lost a campaign. He had come close, twice, and those near losses were in his files, studied and annotated, because near losses were more instructive than clean victories. He reviewed the human fleet projections the morning before the engagement, with the same attention he gave everything. Smaller ships than expected, dispersed formation, no clear command concentration, at least not one his sensors could identify. He noted the unusual spread of the fleet across three-dimensional planes, inefficient for standard engagement. He flagged it as a parameter and built it into his models. His models told him the engagement would last between 4 and 6 hours. Human losses would be significant. Varric losses would be acceptable. He began the engagement. The first 40 minutes followed the projection. Human ships engaged on the outer edge, took damage, pulled back in what his tactical system classified as a disorganized retreat. He adjusted his formation to press the advantage. His wing commanders executed cleanly. The numbers were tracking against his model within a 2% variance. Then the variance shifted. The retreating human ships did not scatter. They scattered in a pattern. He saw it 3 minutes after it began, and felt the small, precise spike of something he would have called unease, if he were a species that used that word. The scattered ships were not fleeing. They were repositioning. The retreat had been a shape. He ordered his left flank to hold position. His left flank reported that holding position was no longer an available option. He pulled up the flank feed. The ships that had retreated were behind his left flank now, and the ships that were supposed to be behind his left flank, the resupply and support formation, the safe interior of his tactical structure, were not behind his left flank anymore. They were gone. Not disabled. Not damaged and drifting. Gone. In the 6 minutes since he had last checked that sector, those ships had been removed from the engagement, in a way his sensors were still trying to classify, running their analysis loops again and again on data that did not fit the available categories. He looked at the tactical display. What had been a clean engagement was now a shape he did not recognize. Human ships were in positions they could not logically be in given the movement data from the previous 40 minutes. His models ran recalculations at a speed that was, for his processing systems, the equivalent of frantic. Nothing matched. He opened a channel to his wing commanders. Fall back to primary formation. Commander, primary formation is there are ships in primary formation that are not ours. He looked at the display again. The human ships that were in his primary formation were not attacking. They were sitting in his formation, in the slots where his own ships were supposed to be. Just sitting there, like they belonged. The display updated. 18 of his ships were gone. He filed an emergency report to the Concorde. At the same time, he began ordering a full withdrawal. His hands were steady. His systems were calm. He was a precise man, and he processed information precisely. And what his information was telling him right now was that he had made a fundamental error of classification. He had looked at the human fleet and seen a smaller version of a familiar thing. It was not a smaller version of a familiar thing. It was a different thing entirely, wearing familiar shapes just long enough for him to build a model around it, and then the shapes had stopped being the point. His report to the Concorde was 7 lines. The human fleet does not employ standard engagement logic. Pattern recognition is not effective. I am withdrawing to reassess. Request Concorde mediation contact with human command. Note: humans do not fight to win engagements. They fight to make winning engagements cost more than the engagement is worth. I am not yet certain what engagement they believe they are fighting. The Concorde received the report and escalated it to priority status within the hour. Mara received the ceasefire proposal 40 minutes after that. She read it. It was thorough. It was fair, by the standards of people who had not just lost 11 billion lives. It offered a structured pause, a mediated dialogue process, a mutual withdrawal of forces to a negotiated perimeter. It used the word reasonable 4 times. She drafted the reply herself. 1 word. She had her communication officer transmit it on the official diplomatic frequency, in the proper format, with all the correct header protocols. Because the header protocols mattered, and she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of saying humanity had been sloppy. The word was no. The reply landed in the Concorde's communications center at the start of their administrative cycle. The officer on duty read it twice, then read it again, then escalated it to his supervisor. His supervisor read it and called an emergency session of the mediation committee. The mediation committee convened. They read the reply. They discussed it for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, a senior member who had been in the Concorde's diplomatic service for 60 years said, slowly, that in his entire career, he had never received a reply to a ceasefire proposal that was a single word. Someone suggested that perhaps it had been truncated in transmission. Someone else checked the transmission record. It had not been truncated. It was the complete communication. 1 word, proper headers, correctly formatted, transmitted from Admiral Mara Osei's personal command frequency. No. There was a long silence in the mediation committee room. Meanwhile, HFY was looking at new data. His analysts had spent 30 hours going through the engagement records, rebuilding the sequence, trying to identify the logic structure underneath the movement patterns. They had found it, eventually. It was elegant, in its way. It required ships to behave as though they did not value their own integrity, to move into positions that accepted damage, accepted loss, in order to shape the larger pattern. His own tactical training had a word for ships that moved into positions, accepting their own probable destruction. The word was expendable, but these ships had not been unmanned. They had crews, human crews who had flown their ships into those positions fully aware of the probable outcomes, because the larger pattern required it. He sat with this information for a long time. He thought about the population correction. He thought about the models he had reviewed before it was executed. The projections that had classified humanity as a long-term threat vector. The models had assessed human behavioral parameters across a range of scenarios. They had noted high aggression indices, strong territorial instincts, elevated responses to perceived threat. None of the models had adequately captured this. This willingness to spend themselves, not recklessly, not in the way of species that simply did not calculate consequence, but deliberately, architecturally, building a strategy out of the acceptance of cost in a way that assumed the cost was worth it. His models had not found an adequate variable for that. He was starting to understand why. He opened a channel to the Concorde and requested updated projections on the current human fleet movement. The updated projections arrived. He looked at them. The human fleet was not consolidating. It was not pulling back. It was continuing to move slowly, in the dispersed non-formation that was not a non-formation deeper into the edge of Varric-controlled space. Not in a way that looked like an attack. In a way that looked like a direction. He thought about the word he had used in his report. Precisa. He had meant it as a warning about their tactics. He was beginning to think it meant something larger. He did not sleep that night. He sat with his data and his models, and the engagement records, and the single-word ceasefire response. And he tried to build a projection that accounted for a species that had decided, in full knowledge of the cost, that the cost was acceptable. Every model he built came to the same conclusion. He deleted each one. He built them again. They kept coming to the same place. He stopped deleting them. The Concorde had been built on a simple agreement. Every species at the table gave up something. Military autonomy, mostly. The right to act alone without consultation, without process, without the long, slow machinery of collective decision-making grinding through to a conclusion. In exchange, they received security, predictability, a shared guarantee that no one species could decide, alone, that another species needed to stop existing. The Varric had been at the table for 400 years. It was becoming apparent, in the rooms where Concorde members spoke honestly rather than officially, that the table had a problem. The Tho-Orin were the oldest species in the Concorde, 7,000 years of continuous membership. Their representative moved slowly in the physical sense, their biology unhurried in a way that other species sometimes read as arrogance, and was actually something closer to the patience of things that had been waiting long enough to know how waiting works. Their name for the Concorde, in their own language, translated roughly as the agreement that prevents the old mistake. Senior Representative Vothon had not spoken publicly since the genocide. She had been listening. She had been listening in the official sessions, in the side chambers, in the hallways where species that did not want their conversations on the record had conversations. She had been listening to the way the Varric's allies constructed careful arguments about context and precedent and the regrettable nature of necessary calculations. She had been listening to the way species that were not the Varric's allies constructed equally careful arguments about process and proportion and the importance of not letting grief drive policy. She had been listening to what no one was saying. What no one was saying was this: the Varric had done it before, not to humanity. To two other species, smaller and less visible in galactic history, species that had since been absorbed into the Concorde's wider community and were now, when asked, very careful about how they talked about that process. The records existed. Old records, in old formats, filed in the Concorde's deep archives under classifications that required specific clearance levels to access. Vothon had those clearance levels. She had read those records many years ago. She had filed her own private assessment. She had decided, at the time, that the Concorde's mechanisms were adequate to prevent repetition. She had been wrong. She did not send Mara a message. Sending a message created a record, and a record created accountability, and accountability, in this particular situation, was a form of slowness she could not afford. She used a private channel that had existed between Tho-Orin representatives and human military command for 11 years, established during a joint survey mission that almost no one remembered anymore. She sent coordinates. That was all. No context. No explanation. No diplomatic language softening the shape of what she was doing. The coordinates were for 6 Varric Command infrastructure sites, not their fleet, not their weapons platforms, but the deep architecture of their command and control network. The nodes that ran their military logistics, their fleet coordination, their real-time tactical processing. Without those nodes, the Varric fleet would still exist. It would just be 12 separate fleet clusters with no way to talk to each other. Mara looked at the coordinates for a long time when they came through. She did not acknowledge the message. She plotted the coordinates. The Tho-Orin's action was not the only fracture. It was the most significant one, but the Concorde was cracking along lines that had always existed. Lines that the structure had papered over for centuries. Species that had quietly shared Varric methodology concerns for decades were now having those concerns loudly, in private, with a speed that suggested the concerns had been waiting for a moment to become something other than concerns. Committees were being convened. Records were being reviewed. Very old votes were being re-examined in light of new context. Species that had approved the Varric's broader security frameworks 30 years ago were discovering, upon review, that their approval had been contingent on certain limitations that had apparently not been applied. Nobody was doing this loudly. That was the thing. It was all quiet, measured, procedural. The Concorde was revising its own history, with the same careful language it used for everything, moving the furniture of collective responsibility without anyone having to be seen moving it. Meanwhile, Yusuf Ibarra finished his last file. He had been working for 8 months, with almost no breaks. His team had stopped commenting on his hours. The data they were building was dense and exact, cross-referencing Varrock biological and neurological literature from 6 decades of published research, most of it written by Varrock scientists, peer-reviewed in Varrock academic journals, sitting in accessible databases that anyone could read if they had the background to understand what they were reading. He had the background. The data package he built was not a weapon. It contained no code, no biological agent, no delivery mechanism of any kind. It was a document. A very long, very precise document, formatted in the Varrock's own academic citation style, using their own units of measurement, their own mathematical notation, their own actuarial framework, the framework they had used to justify the genocide, applied, with complete rigor and accuracy, to the Varrock themselves. He had taken their model and run it on their data. Population growth rate, resource consumption, expansion patterns, influence on neighboring species' political stability. He had used their exact definitions, their exact thresholds, their exact criteria for what constituted a long-term threat vector. By their own math, the Varrock met 3 of the 5 threshold criteria. By their own definition, the Varrock represented a significant risk to galactic stability. By their own logic, the acceptable cost of addressing that risk was 94% of their population. Yusuf transmitted the document on an open frequency, every available channel, the Varrock academic bands, the Concorde's public information network, the civilian channels that served refugee populations, the frequencies the galactic press monitored. He did not send it privately. He did not send it as a threat. He formatted it as a research paper and submitted it to the 5 most prominent Varrock academic journals simultaneously. He titled it, "A Consistent Application." Sarah looked at him after it went out. He was leaning back in his chair, looking at his screen, his face very calm and very tired. "Yusuf," she said. "I know," he said. She didn't ask what he knew. It covered too much ground. On Priya's end, the supply chain work was nearly complete. She had spent 8 months building a network that didn't look like a network. It looked like a lot of individual people, on a lot of different colonies, doing a lot of unrelated things, managing cargo manifests, coordinating repair schedules, arranging the kind of small logistical details that colonial administration was full of and paid very little attention to. Individually, none of it was notable. Together, it formed a structure that ran through 11 Varrock-controlled transit systems, like water, through a cracked foundation. She had not blown anything up. She had not destroyed anything. She had simply made it so that the supplies moving through those systems arrived at the wrong places, at the wrong times, in conditions that were just slightly not right. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked deliberate. Just a consistent, grinding, invisible friction applied to every part of the logistical structure that kept Varrock military operations fed, fueled, and functional. The Varrock's analysts had spent 3 months trying to find the source of the disruption. They found individuals, sometimes. They patched holes. The holes moved. The disruption continued. It was not satisfying work in the way that visible action is satisfying. There were no dramatic moments. She went to bed most nights, having moved cargo numbers around on screens and rewritten manifest codes, and sent encrypted messages to people she had never met in person. She hummed while she did it. When HFY finally opened a channel to Mara not to negotiate, not to propose terms, just to speak, his voice was the voice of a precise man who had run every model available to him and was looking at what the models had produced. "You would truly do this," he said. "You would spend yourselves to ruin us." Mara looked at him across the transmission delay. She had not slept more than 4 hours in 2 days. She looked exactly as tired as she was, which was a kind of honesty she had stopped trying to disguise. She thought about a lot of things in the pause before she spoke. She thought about the glass room and the cold coffee and the number on the screen. She thought about Han's careful footsteps, and Chen Wei's still face and Yusuf's 2 words. She thought about a refugee colony kitchen and the low sound of someone humming. "We already spent ourselves," she said. She closed the channel. Outside, the fleet was in motion. 12 dispersed, non-formation clusters, moving with the patient, directional purpose of something that had decided where it was going. The coordinates Vothan had sent were already plotted. The Concorde was still meeting. Nobody was waiting for the Concorde. The Varrock did not surrender dramatically. There was no final battle. No single decisive moment where the outcome crystallized, and everyone present knew they were watching history arrive. The end of the war looked, from the outside, like a long and very quiet administrative process, which was, perhaps, appropriate, given that it had been started by people who called a genocide a bilateral incident. HFY submitted the formal terms through the Concorde's standard cessation framework. He did it methodically, checking each requirement, filling each field. His hands were steady. He was a precise man. He did not stop being precise, because the precision was now serving a different conclusion than the one he had spent his career building toward. The terms took 4 hours to finalize. 3 years. 4 hours of paperwork to close it. Priya heard the news in the colony kitchen. She was making flatbread because the morning shift had come in, and people needed to eat, and the person who usually managed breakfast had been unwell, and the flatbread needed to be made, so she was making it. The announcement came over the colony's general broadcast channel, a human diplomatic aide whose voice was carefully calibrated for gravity and relief, and she listened to it while her hands kept moving, pressing the dough against the hot surface of the pan. She turned the bread. It needed another minute. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was the absence of a feeling she could not name. She had spent so long in the place past grief that she had forgotten there was supposed to be something on the other side of it. Victory was supposed to mean something different than this. It was supposed to lift. She had seen it lift other people in other circumstances. The bread was done. She moved it to the rack. Started the next one. Around her, people were talking, some of them crying, some of them embracing. She stood at the pan and kept working and did not hum. For once, the kitchen was loud enough without it. Later, she sat outside on a step that caught the colony's artificial morning light and ate a piece of the flatbread she had made and looked at the sky that was not any sky she had grown up under. She stayed there for a while, long enough for the light cycle to shift slightly. Then she went back inside. There was a lot to rebuild. That question, what to do next, still had an answer. It was just a different one now. Yusuf deleted his files the same afternoon. The terms were confirmed. All of them. The data, the models, the 8 months of accumulated work, the paper he had titled A Consistent Application, and transmitted to 5 academic journals, who had, to his knowledge, still not officially acknowledged receiving it. He went through each folder methodically and removed everything. Then he sat for a moment in the empty room, looking at a screen that showed nothing. He stood up, put on his jacket, went outside for the first time, in what turned out to be longer than he had tracked. The colony's air was recycled in a way that was perfectly adequate for human biology and perfectly distinct from any air he had ever breathed on Earth. He noticed this. He had stopped noticing it at some point during the past months, and now he was noticing it again. He walked for an hour. He did not think about the equations. He was very deliberate about not thinking about the equations, which meant the equations were present in his mind as a shape he was carefully walking around, but that was all right. He was a patient man. He could walk around a shape for as long as it took. He found a bench near the colony's central water feature, a small, artificial pond that had no reason for existing, except that someone had decided people needed something that moved in a living way, and he sat there and watched the water. He stayed until the light cycle shifted again. The Concorde's invitation to humanity came 3 weeks after the cessation. It arrived as a formal document, properly formatted, signed by the presiding representatives of 41 member species. Full standing membership, permanent seat at the high table, full voice in all proceedings. The language was warm. It spoke of humanity's demonstrated resilience and the galactic community's desire to move forward in a spirit of shared purpose. The diplomatic corps prepared an acceptance speech. It was 12 paragraphs long. It acknowledged the suffering of the past years. It expressed gratitude for the invitation. It used words like partnership and commitment and future. It had been written by 3 people with a combined 90 years of diplomatic experience, and it was a very good speech, and it was exactly what the moment was supposed to call for. Mara read it twice. She set it down on the glass table. She sat in the glass room that had been quiet for 3 years in the particular way of spaces where something large has been lost. And she looked out at the dark, through the viewport, and she thought for a while. Not strategically. Not tactically. She just let the thinking happen, in whatever shape it wanted to take. Then she picked up a pen and a blank piece of paper and wrote her speech in 11 minutes. When she stood at the Concord's formal assembly, she looked different than she had 3 years ago. The same precise face, the same stillness, but the kind of tired that had moved in past the surface and become structural. A tiredness she had stopped waiting to sleep off, because she understood now that it was not that kind of tired. The chamber was enormous. Species from 41 civilizations, sitting in the curved tiers of an architecture built to make individuals feel like part of something larger. It had been doing that job for centuries. The lighting was neutral and careful. Everything was designed to feel significant. She looked at her 11 minutes of paper. She read it. We are here. We remember what it cost to get here. We will remember what you did not do. We will not forget either one. 23 words. The silence after them was the longest silence the Concord Chamber had experienced in its formal record of proceedings, which went back 400 years. Later, people who had been present would describe it differently. Some said it lasted 10 seconds. Some said closer to 30. Some said it was impossible to measure because it had a quality that made ordinary time feel like the wrong unit. In the chamber's third tier, the Tho-Orin representative, Senior Representative Vo Thon, who had been in this chamber for longer than most species had been at the table, raised her hands together slowly. She began to applaud. She was old. The movement was slow. It made a soft sound in the large space. Then a representative from the Lethkeri joined. Then 3 from the Sorveth delegation. Then others, one by one, in a pace that was not enthusiastic, but was deliberate. Each choice to join visible, individual, chosen. Not all of them. Some sat still. Some would sit still for years. But enough. Mara stood at the podium and did not smile, and did not perform relief, and did not give the moment anything it had not earned. She folded her paper. She put it in her jacket pocket. She walked back to her seat. She was back on the orbital station by evening. The glass room. The same chair. The same viewport with the same dark outside it. The dark that would always have the shape of something missing in it because that was the shape it had now, and shapes like that did not go away. They just became the shape of the thing. She opened the casualty report. The one she had never finished annotating. 3 years old now. The formatting slightly dated. The file sitting in a folder she had not deleted because she had not been able to delete it and had stopped lying to herself about why. She scrolled to the final page. The last number on the last page. She took the pen from her jacket pocket. The same pen. The one she had capped in the meeting 3 years ago when someone had called 11 billion deaths a bilateral incident. She wrote 2 words in the margin next to the number. Small handwriting. Regular. No flourish. We counted. She closed the report. She stood up. She turned off the screen. The light from the viewport fell across the empty glass table in the particular way of light that has traveled very far to reach somewhere, which is all light, always, but which is more obvious in space, where you can see how far the dark goes before it reaches anything worth landing on. She left the room. The door closed behind her. The station hummed, low and constant, the sound of a living thing that was still running, still working, still carrying the weight of being the place where what remained was held. Outside the viewport, the dark held its shape. It would hold it for a long time. That was all right. Holding the shape of things was not nothing. Sometimes it was everything.